Our intellectual odyssey is moving into new waters. Over the next 8 lectures, we're going to do an overview of the major ideas in the social sciences, ranging from anthropology through linguistics to psychology and cognitive science. And our reasons for doing this are twofold. First of all, because the sciences are not only the physical sciences. The social sciences are also part of the cultural phenomenon of science in the 20th century. The social sciences also have had profound social, cultural, and intellectual implications for society, analogous to the impact of the physical sciences, and perhaps for the general public even more, as we will see, especially when we talk about sociology, political science, and economics. Secondly, because quite surprisingly, perhaps to many people, there are analogies between the conceptual structures of the social sciences and the physical sciences. I think we are going to see that there are certain basal ideas that cut across the disciplines, and you can guess for sure what at least 2 of these are, namely the reality of relationships and the power of structures. So those would be 2 obvious ones that we've already seen in physics, in chemistry, in biology, and we will see becoming part of the intellectual armature of the social sciences, and not, I believe, because of copying. So it raises interesting questions about how the intellectual climate of a society is structured. Is itself structured? What we used to call the spirit of the times, but that's a very loose way of speaking, especially when we're talking about science. So for anyone who was born in the second half of the 20th century, for sure, it is quite natural to think of the life sciences as being classified together with the physical sciences as a hard science. This was not necessarily the case in the 19th century or even the early part of the 20th century, but after the last 2 lectures on molecular biology and molecular medicine, it's quite clear that you would not get much of an argument that the biological sciences at the end of the 20th century are hard sciences, so to speak. And this is tied up with that whole phenomenon of reductionism that we talked about in lecture 25. What we're going to do now is start talking about the human sciences or the social sciences, which seem not to be scientific in the same way, not because they don't use mathematics, let's say, because they often do, especially in economic theory. There is intensive use of mathematical modeling, and not because they don't do experiments, because very often they do experiments. They don't seem to be scientific in the same way that the hard sciences are, because they seem to violate the fact-value dichotomy that is a fundamental principle of modern science. That modern science promoted itself from the 17th century on as value neutral, that all we do is tell the facts. We describe things the way they are. The personal values of the experimenter, of the researcher, are not part of the published material. They may have had personal motives for becoming a physicist or for adopting a particular line of research, but the results are stripped of all of the personal values. They are common to everyone, and they have no implications for the person. So by stripping away the relationship between the person and knowledge, you also strip away the implications of knowledge for the person. There is a gulf, there is an unbridgeable gulf in 18th, 19th, and early 20th century science, physical science, between facts and values. But in social science, you can't escape value judgments. And this was perceived as a serious intellectual problem by the end of the 19th century, in part because the growing social influence and power of physical science made people who were studying social science want to be included in the category science. And in Germany in particular, the term Wissenschaft, which doesn't mean exactly knowledge. What it means is something like systematic scholarly knowledge. A systematic methodology for acquiring knowledge was used to define two branches: Naturwissenschaft, natural systematic knowledge, namely science, but meaning science, so to speak, of the hard kind, and Geisteswissenschaft, the human sciences. The question that came up over and over again, the issue that this raised was, how can the human sciences, how can Geisteswissenschaft be on an intellectual par with Naturwissenschaft? We are going to see this come up again and again as we look at the social sciences. It continues to be an issue for social sciences that they must have a clear methodology that will allow them to say, this is why we are a science as opposed to a collection of anecdotal materials. What is it that makes a science? We begin with anthropology because conceptually, at least, that seems to be the first of the human sciences. The question that anthropologists deal with all orient around what it means to be human. What does it mean to be human? How can we study this question scientifically? How does being human manifest itself in the world? So at one level, well, we have a kind of an empirical methodology in which you simply collect, you go around the world collecting information about the way people live. This, on the face of it, would not seem to be a science. It may be interesting, it may be valuable information, but it does not have explanatory power. And we associate science with explanatory power because we are, for whatever reason, intellectually and psychologically overwhelmed by the successes of the physical and life sciences. So we ask sciences to provide us with explanatory power, not just lots of information. This goes back to an old issue in the sciences having to do with natural history methodology. Natural history refers to just collecting specimens. So if you collect a specimen of every butterfly type in the world, you'd have a heck of a lot of specimens, but you would not necessarily understand anything about butterflies, but you would have one of each of them. So that is one approach to studying nature, collecting specimens from a causal explanatory methodology, looks at those butterflies and tries to understand why butterflies are the way they are. So, for example, I've referred to this before, developmental sequencing is, and the evolutionary interpretation of developmental sequencing of fossils is a way of, so to speak, converting a collection methodology into an explanatory methodology. And that's what we begin to see with anthropology. Anthropology early in its history, and it was born, so to speak, in the 19th century, especially in the last third of the 19th century, when Europeans started traveling around the world collecting information about primitive cultures. Culture became the focus of anthropology. Now we know anthropology is the science of culture. Anthropology's object as a science is to study culture. Now we have to ask, what is the methodology by which we're going to study the culture? And what is a culture anyway? Is a culture a thing? Does it have a status in the world of a thing? Is it real that it can exercise forces? Or is it a name like species or style? Now, we can recognize Renaissance style painting and distinguish it from Baroque style painting, but style is not a thing. Style doesn't force anyone to do anything. Style, and it's very difficult to define style precisely, and yet we can use the term as a discriminator quite easily. So what is culture? Do cultures develop lawfully? Are cultures, is there some force at work within cultures that causes them to develop over time in one way rather than another way? These would be the kinds of questions that now make up the intellectual content of anthropology. And in the course of the 20th century, we'll see, I think, a fascinating evolution of the science called anthropology. Early in the century, two important figures were Bronislaw Malinowski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown. Both of them studied so-called primitive cultures, or the cultures of people that Europeans considered to be primitive. But they had, even though they were colleagues, they were certainly not, they were not intellectual pals. They had polar opposing views of culture. Malinowski studied cultures as cultural processes, rituals, the institutions of a people as expressions of their biological, psychological, and sociological needs. Individuals have biological needs, psychological needs, sociological needs, and they create institutions and rituals and values that satisfy those needs. So for Malinowski, culture is a product of human beings who have needs and who create means of satisfying those needs. Not just cooking recipes, but satisfying psychological needs and sociological needs as well as biological ones. Radcliffe Brown looked at it the other way around. He was only interested in the way that existing cultures caused individuals to behave in one way rather than another. That growing up within one culture caused you to behave in one way rather than growing up in another culture. For Radcliffe Brown, culture was the given, and it was the way that culture, he was interested in understanding how cultures caused the individuals who were born into them to have the values that they have and that they had and to display the behaviors that they did. So these are two opposing methodologies and two contrasting methodologies, conceptions of what a culture is and of what is interesting and important to understand in a culture. At the same time, early 20th century, German anthropologists were interested in what's called ethnology. They were interested in studying the specific rituals of individual cultures, a much narrower focus. And American anthropology now comes onto the scene and becomes, as all the American social sciences do in the course of the 20th century, if not globally dominant, but a major intellectual influence in global social science, which American thinking had not been in the 19th century. So just as in the physical sciences, American science became globally dominant in the course of the 20th century, especially after World War II, in the social sciences, even earlier, American ideas became increasingly important and increasingly emulated. American anthropology initially was dominated by a German immigrant named Franz Boas, who came to this country in the early 1900s and became a towering intellectual influence in a number of fields. We'll see him come up again in sociology and linguistics, for example. Boas was a relativist. Boas believed that there was no law driving cultures through some evolutionary development cycle, that every culture had its own integrity that needed to be respected and understood as its own adaptation to the world as the people of that culture understood it. And therefore our job was to go out and study it, and literally study it respecting its own integrity, and study its language, study its rituals, without trying to make any judgments about them. His students, and the most famous of them are Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, created a school that was called Culture and Personality. What they were interested in, analogous to Radcliffe Brown, was how do people grow up internalizing the institutions, the rituals, and the values of the culture in which they belong. So, for example, when Margaret Mead wrote her extremely influential, even if possibly completely incorrect, Coming of Age in Samoa, the motive was to understand why the teenagehood in Western European and American society was such a painful psychological experience, whereas in Polynesia, being a teenager was a quite happy experience. And the idea being that the teenagers in the West behave the way they do, have the anxiety and stress that they do, because they are internalizing features of their culture that create conflict within them. That being a teenager is not naturally stressful and anxiety generating. This is a reflection of internalizing external processes. And if you go to another culture in which there are different external structures, then being a teenager is fundamentally different. So that was the idea. Culture and person. Boas's influence here was a highly relativist one. Ruth Benedict's famous book is called Patterns of Culture. Again, there is no way of judging the way people behave and what they believe in and what they do. You have to recognize that cultures have a wholeness and an integrity, and the people who grow up in those cultures reflect the kinds of values and processes that that are distinctive of that particular culture. Benedict and Mead and a number of other Boas students were anti-Freudian in the sense that they rejected Freud's notion of an unconscious that is responsible for why you behave the way you do. But not all Boasians were anti-Freudian, and however, those are much less well known. Abraham Cardina, for example, was a Boasian who thought that Freud's views and Boas's views of culture and the way that personality reflects culture were compatible with one another. But this was this empirical, relativistic approach to the study of culture was very distinctively American in the period, roughly speaking, from 1920 to 1950. In 1950, there was a sharp reversal. Leslie White and Julian Stewart, in particular, led a movement to shift anthropology in the direction of the hard sciences. That this humanistic personality culture stuff was all too airy-fairy. This is not science. If you want to be an anthropologist and you want to claim that anthropology is a science, then you've got to be scientific. That means that culture must be understood materialistically, deterministically. And they claimed that every culture had a kind of an inner structure that evolved deterministically. Well, I shouldn't use evolved and deterministically together after what we've been talking about. That unfolded deterministically over time, and that a factor driving this unfolding were the technological systems available to that culture. So by understanding the materialistic structure of a culture, we got a handle on how that culture represented an adaptation to a particular kind of cultural niche. So it's ecological anthropology. In fact, subsequent students of White and Stewart use that term, ecological anthropology. It's a way of looking at a culture as a materialistically driven system that has laws. And that's the job of the anthropologist, to understand what are the causal mechanisms at work in a culture that are responsible for the way that it unfolds in time. This has some similarities to the Marx and Engels interpretation of culture, which of course was also very materialistic, except for the class conflict part. Of course, from the Marxist point of view, once you take the class conflict out, then there's no Marxism left. But the idea of what they share in common is the idea that cultures develop over time for materialistic reasons, for deterministic, and they develop deterministically, and it's up to the anthropologist to understand what are the laws of that kind of development. This hard anthropology, with this materialistic, deterministic interpretation of culture, became increasingly prominent in the 1950s and into the 1960s. It was complemented in the 1960s by a tidal wave that overwhelmed all of Western European and American intellectual life, and that was something called structuralism. And now, we're ready for that. Claude Lévi-Strauss, a French anthropologist, published a number of research works that claimed that culture was structure, that what made a culture what it was the network of relationships characteristic of that culture, that all meanings and values derive from the structure of that network of relationships, because different network structures give you different kinds of meanings and values. So, and we'll come up against this notion again in other sciences. Networks have different structures. Depending on the structure, wherever you have structural similarities, then you're going to have the same kinds of meanings and values. So it was this was applied not just in anthropology, but it was applied to literary criticism. It was applied to political science, to sociology. This structuralism became the most fashionable intellectual movement of the 1960s and 1970s. And this was an alternative to, but was not necessarily in opposition to, White and Stewart's ecological anthropology. In the 1980s and 1970s, beginning in the 1970s, a number of very prominent anthropologists defected from the White-Stewart materialistic interpretation of culture, and two of the most famous of these are Clifford Geertz and Marshall Solins. both of them had previously been hard anthropologists. And they decided that this materialistic, deterministic approach to culture, with its emphasis on the role that technological systems play in a culture, in driving a culture's unfolding, they felt that missed fundamental features of culture. And this should remind us a little bit of what I said about the way that molecular biology seems to miss something important about life. For Solons and Geertz, cultures are symbol-producing systems. That the key to a culture is the meaning of the symbols to the people in that culture. And you can't get that from just looking at material artifacts. That in order to understand a culture, you have to understand what the artifacts mean to the people who are members of that culture. And that can't be read from things. It can only be obtained from the people, directly or indirectly. So Geertz and Solons in the 1970s and especially in the 1980s generated a more humanistic anthropology focusing on cultures as symbol-producing systems. In the 80s and 90s, there was a reaction to this, saying that, look, we've got to get back to, this is more like the Boas soft stuff. We really need to get back to hard anthropology. And in the 1990s especially, there was a kind of updated version of the White and Stewart approach to anthropology that now used materials from cognitive science and this ecological anthropology approach to once again try to apply hard science concepts and methodologies to understanding culture. It boils down to an updated version of materialistic determinism again. And this became a serious enough issue that in 2002, on the 100th anniversary of the American Anthropological Association meeting, which was supposed to be a happy celebration, 100 years of the American Anthropological Association, a group walked out and founded a rival group, the Society for Scientific Anthropology, as a way of protesting that at the age of 100, the American Anthropological Association had been essentially co-opted by humanists, and we are the scientific anthropologists. Let's take a very brief look at the material side of anthropology, because we see as an issue here, if we're studying culture, should we be studying material remains? Should we be studying the networks of personal and social relationships, like kinship relationships within the culture? Should we be studying the technologies? Well, archaeology is that science which looks at the material side of anthropology. And we will see something now very similar happening in the evolution of archaeology between 1900 and 2000. Archaeology, too, is a science that began in the 19th century in the sense that systematic collecting of ruins and artifacts began in the second half, especially of the 19th century. And by the 1900s, it had become scientific in the sense that there was a group of people who now were inventing methods for collecting artifacts in ways that would allow us to date them and compare them objectively, as opposed to simply digging around and finding an old Greek jar here and a broken Chinese horse here. Now we have some sort of scientific approach to collecting materials. So archaeology begins in a way that we just described as a kind of a natural history approach, collecting stuff, collecting data. Of course, we're trying our best to do it systematically so we know which stuff is older than which stuff. When you dig a gigantic hole in the ground, then unless you're very careful, you won't know which materials are on top of which other materials, and you won't be able to say, well, this is older than that. So you have to have an objective approach. You have to have a method for unearthing the past. And given the prejudices of the time, we're talking about European archaeologists after all, the focus was on classical and biblical archaeology and on either art or texts. And this sort of natural history approach to archaeology dominated the period from, roughly speaking, 1900 through the 1940s. After World War II, archaeology also decided that we need to be more explanatory and we need to be more scientific. And archaeology, this is roughly the same period of time that White and Stewart are trying to overturn the Boasian culture and personality school in anthropology. Archaeologists, now enriched by Willard Libby's invention of radiocarbon dating, are now saying, this can be the opening wedge to making archaeology not just a matter of collecting, but we can now more seriously attempt to do developmental sequencing. And once you start down that path of developmental sequencing, you are also starting down a path of interpretation and explanation. And the path moves between 1950 and 2000 in the direction of explaining or reconstructing lifestyles. That it's not just a matter anymore of showing what beautiful objects were produced in ancient China or in ancient Greece, but it's a matter of reconstructing lifestyles, including relatively recent lifestyles of peoples, and trying to understand why people produced what they produced, why they lived the way they did, why they had the relationships that they had. So this brings archaeology even closer to anthropology. And especially in America, archaeology and anthropology have a much closer disciplinary and institutional relationship than they do in Europe, for example. But even in Europe, archaeology and anthropology have moved in a sort of convergent path, because archaeologists have become increasingly multidisciplinary and increasingly use tools and techniques borrowed from physics, chemistry, biology, material science. Right? There is, for example, archaeologists who study textiles, who collect textiles, are able to identify exactly the kind of loom that was used to make a certain textile. When you know the kind of loom, then you know a certain technology, and you can put that in a sequence of technologies and say, well, this kind of loom was only available 2,200 years ago in this particular region of the world, and you can then work backwards and figure out more about that culture than without understanding how to look at the specimen of fabric technologically. You can read out from this piece of fabric much more. So to give a concrete illustration of this, for example, a real-world illustration of it, a historian of fabric technology looking at a piece of Cheviot cloth that was unearthed in central China and dated to approximately 2000 to 2200 BCE, was able to prove that this had to be made by Celtic weavers. Now, the Celts lived in Western Europe. That raises an interesting question. How could there be Celtic fabric in the Taklamakan desert of China 4,000 years ago? And in fact, this fabric was on the bodies of, preserved bodies of a man, a woman, and a child who were clearly Caucasians, both the man and the woman approximately 6 feet tall and light-haired, and wearing fabric. Now, the fabric unquestionably traces back to West European Celts. So here we have, we see how the application of technology to archaeological artifacts opens up whole new kinds of anthropological questions. Clearly, there must have been trade routes 4,000 years ago that brought Celts to central China. And so it was not only China influencing the West by way of, let's say, the compass and printing and gunpowder, but the West apparently influenced China as well. So between 1959, especially when Joseph Caldwell called for a new American archaeology more focused on something like ecological anthropology that looked at the way cultures adapted, that used artifacts to adapt to their environments. At the end of the 20th century, archaeologists now are multidisciplinary, collaborative, very interested in the way that cultures interact with one another. How does cultural change reflect cultural drift, analogous to genetic drift, just random change? How does it reflect cross-cultural influences? This has enormously enriched the job of archaeologists. In 1900, you were digging up the past. In 2000, you're trying to explain the complex processes by which cultures develop over time. So both in the case of archaeology and in the case of anthropology, we see a very substantial conceptual evolution in the course of the 20th century.